You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Observing Saudi Arabia is like watching a gymnast dismount the balance beam in slow motion. As the body twists frame by frame through the air, we instinctively hold our breath to see if the hurtling gymnast will nail the landing or crash to the mat. So it is with the Al Saud monarchy of Saudi Arabia. That's an excerpt from the first chapter of On Saudi Arabia, Its People, Past, Religion, Fault Lines, and Future. The book was published in 2013, but the sentiment still holds a decade later. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has laid out a bold vision for Saudi Arabia's future, and while the kingdom is beginning to transition away from a strictly oil-backed economy, there are still questions about whether economic power brokering can overcome decades of repression and human rights abuses. Lost in the news was the 5th anniversary of the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi was a dissident, writing against bin Salman's regime, and he was killed at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2, 2018, on the order of the Crown Prince. Though the international condemnations of bin Salman have subsided, his reputation isn't rehabilitated. So where does MBS go from here? I'm joined now by Karen Elliott House, a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and a former chair of the board of the RAND Corporation. She's also the author of On Saudi Arabia. She's covered the kingdom for over 4 decades. Karen Elliott House, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray.
Does this Hamas attack and the subsequent war force other regional actors with whom Israel might be seeking more normal relations to sort of refine the Palestinian corner in this long-running dispute, to go back to maybe the posture that they held in earlier decades?
Well, it's clearly put a strain on the UAE and other Gulf nations that recognized Israel as part of the Abraham Accords. I think, however, that while now you have students at Harvard celebrating the slaughter of Israelis, and a lot of Arabs clearly emotionally moved by this, it has aroused all of the Israel is a big bully and abuses the Palestinian sentiment. But I think it will also, at some level, make it easier for Israel if it chooses, as many people have thought for some time it would, at some point in the near future, choose to strike Iran and its nuclear program. That would have been very, very controversial, and it'll still be controversial if it happens, but there will be more understanding of why Israel would feel the need to strike a country like Iran, given the Iranian role in funding and supporting and encouraging Hamas in this attack.
Well, certainly a lot of attention is going to be paid to how this all complicates Israel's diplomatic road. What about the Saudis? They've publicly been friendlier with China and Russia. They've explored a different relationship with Iran. What do the Hamas attacks and Israel's response do to the initiatives that Mohammed bin Salman had going, not only in the wider region, but in the wider world?
I don't think any of this, as I said earlier, I think it will delay his efforts to have a diplomatic relations with Israel. But I don't think anything can deter him from his goal of being a big man on the world stage. Saudi Arabia, as he said in the interview with Fox a few weeks ago, was the number 10 economy in the world in the 1980s, and now it's 17th. And Korea, which was then way down, is now, I believe, 10th. He's determined to get back to being a major influence on the world stage, and that's why he's No longer, he does not trust the U.S. to protect Saudi Arabia. He is playing his cards with Russia to control oil prices, with China, his biggest oil purchaser, with India, with whom he hopes to basically be the link between India and Asia and Europe, passing through Saudi Arabia, Israel, as the big logistics hub. I mean, he has very, very big plans, and Hamas is not likely to knock him off of those plans. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is at risk if there is a confrontation with Iran, because Saudi's right next door, and it's easier for the Iranians to get revenge on Saudi Arabia rather than nuclear Israel. But his plans to punch above the weight of Saudi Arabia in the world are very much alive, I would bet, in his mind now.
Given what you just said, the world that you described, that Mohammed bin Salman sees from his office in Riyadh, are the Saudis still as overtly, as self-consciously, as publicly tending to these roles as well as the ones you just described?
I think he is something of a Pied Piper, if you will. He is piping the tune of nationalism and young people who grew up under the heavy hand of Wahhabi religion that his uncles turned the country over to in the 80s and 90s and early 2000. He has eliminated that by getting rid of the religious police, subduing the role of religion.
To what end, though, ultimately? Is it clear from the way he's leveraging the country's clout in the 21st century where he wants to take this, what the young crown prince wants for the country 10 years from now, 20 years from now?
Well, he intends, and this is a big transition, but to make Saudi Arabia a, quote, normal country that is a powerful economy, that has a big sports calendar and fancy tourism resorts to attract foreigners, to spend money in the country to get the kingdom where it is not dependent for 80% of its government revenue on oil, but to have an economy that's sustained by tourism, by sports, by high-tech industries, by the logistics center that he hopes to make Saudi Israel as a way of transiting goods from Asia to Europe. It's not a transition that's going to occur easily or quickly. It takes a lot of educated Saudis. It takes, I think, a relationship with Israel to get access to high tech from both Israel and the West, who feel more comfortable with Saudi Arabia. If it is aligned with a country like Israel that Americans, by and large, defend and feel comfortable with. So he has many, many, many things to do, but he's very driven and focused on doing them. And he's making clear to the U.S. that I have a lot of options for achieving my goals. I am going to be friendly with Russia so we can keep the oil price high as the two big producers other than the U.S. I'm going to be friendly with China because they are my biggest oil buyer and they can provide me technology. They can provide investment. I'm going to deal with India. I'm going to deal with everybody. I'm no longer a puppy dog behind Uncle Sam.
Saudi Arabia is a big country with a relatively small population. You talked about human capital and getting an educated population. It also relies a lot on foreign workers to supply much of the muscle and brain power that it can't supply for itself right now. Can you get to that place you just described with just the power of money? Can he overcome the natural, geographical, and human barriers that might exist toward becoming that kind of country you just talked about?
That's why I think he believes it has to become a more, quote, normal country. There's no alcohol there now. I mean, people have alcohol, but there's no alcohol sold in public. But otherwise now, men and women can mix, women can drive, women are working everywhere in the economy, including a female astronaut this year. So that helps to attract upscale, educated Western workers, because they're not going to come to a place where their wife can't do anything. So that he is getting done, which opens the door. Educating his own people. King Abdullah started some of that by sending 250,000 Saudis to American mostly, but to American and foreign universities. So there is an educated middle class, but there are only 20 million Saudis, and most of them are not in the world of work. So they are dependent on high-skilled foreigners and very low-skilled Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Indians, Yemenis that come in and do the menial labor in the country. So until they can educate enough people, they are going to be highly dependent on foreigners. And if you're highly dependent on skilled foreigners, you have to provide a lifestyle that would attract them and security. And so they have to make sure they don't have terrorist attacks. And of course, the biggest threat to everything he's trying to do is Iran. I mean, he's spending trillions of dollars to transform the economy, and the Iranians are sitting there able to rain down missiles and drones on him and overwhelm the way Hamas overwhelmed Israel's missile defense system. So I don't envy him, at least the task he's set for himself, but I think he genuinely believes that the country had to do this to survive. It couldn't count on another 30 years of just taking in oil revenue and give them to people whether they work or not, and subsidize energy costs, subsidize electricity costs, subsidize waste of all sorts. They have eliminated a lot of that waste and tried to eliminate some of the corruption that costs the country so many billions of dollars a year.
We've only tangentially talked about the United States, but you did mention that for a long time, the United States was the Saudis' security shield. You mentioned that Mohammed bin Salman is stepping away from that, doesn't want that to be the case. But the United States still has a lot of juice in Saudi Arabia, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not so much that he doesn't want that to be the case as that he doesn't believe it is the case. In other words, he does not believe the U.S. anymore can be counted upon, because in 2019, when the Iranians struck Abqaiq, the biggest Saudi oil facility on the Persian Gulf, the U.S. did absolutely nothing. Trump basically said it's a Saudi issue, take care of it. And the Saudis had already begun to distrust the U.S. because Bush invaded Iraq when they begged him not to, and Obama drew his red line in Syria about the use of chemical weapons. And when the Syrians used them, didn't retaliate in any way. The U.S. does still have a great deal of capability, and vastly more than the Chinese have, and the Chinese cannot protect him. So that's the reason I think he is doing all kinds of things on his own. They're trying to create a defense industry in Saudi Arabia, and this is a particularly difficult task, but to create a local defense industry so that they are no longer reliant on the U.S. for 80% of their military purchases. And they are trying to just simply diversify their friendships. As we've all heard in these efforts to Saudi, Israel, and the Biden administration to come up with some three-way package, that the Saudis are said to be insisting on a U.S. security commitment to Saudi Arabia. I am not sure why they would believe any security commitment the U.S. gave them, given that they're so distrustful of the past. But they do understand that the U.S. is the one that would have to save them. I think he's just more confident than his father's generation that the U.S. will be smart enough to look after its own interest. And thus, when something like the attacks on Israel happen, or certainly if this widens into a war where Iran becomes involved, that the U.S. will see it in its own interest not to have Iran dominating the Persian Gulf, and will thus do something.
In previous decades, it was thought to be, quietly, so essential to have a stable Saudi Arabia for American interests that even while American presidents were beating up other countries over their human rights records, or preaching democracy, or urging free and fair elections, the Saudis had carved out their own space of exception, let's say, that they wouldn't be pressured too much on any of these questions, from Ronald Reagan, from George W. Bush, from Bill Clinton. Is that time over? The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was very inconvenient for the United States. A legal resident, a columnist for the Washington Post, mentioned prominently by Joe Biden. There was a tense, frosty meeting between Mohammed bin Salman and Joe Biden. Is Saudi Arabia able to exist in that carved-out space, even as it looks for something more like an Israeli-style security guarantee from Washington?
Yeah, I think it is existing in a new space, if you will, that he stood up to Joe Biden. I mean, Biden said he was going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah, and he clearly intended to make the Crown Prince a pariah. And in the end, he went hat in hand to Jeddah begging for more oil, and the Crown Prince, as the ad goes, just said no. And now you have Biden out there anxiously trying to do a deal to get Saudi Arabia and Israel together so that hopefully he would have an excuse for providing more security. He would get more oil, I'm sure, would be the unspoken hope or obligation if there is a deal. So I think the Crown Prince has actually called the bluff of the United States. And so far, he still doesn't have a security deal, but he's no worse off. He still needs the United States, and he knows that, but he is not going to be the puppy dog anymore. He's going to be free to deal with everyone. And if the U.S. wants to deal with him in that context, he will be very happy. But he's not going to put the country's total security in the hands of one country again.
I see opinion writing from time to time that dismisses MBS as an autocrat who doesn't know what he doesn't know, and sometimes mocks some of the gigantic public works projects that seem to be just flights of fancy. But when you dismiss MBS as an autocrat, are you missing something important and internal about Saudi Arabia that's necessary for someone like the Crown Prince to maintain authority and maintain solidarity inside the society? Is he not really a detached autocrat, but someone who needs the support of a couple of tens of thousands of royal connected people, elites in the major cities, elites in the major industries? Is he in his job not only through the gift of the current king, whoever that aging person may be?
He is the seventh son of the current king. In a hierarchical society, the seventh son would amount to nothing. MBS set out, at least by his teenage years, I think, to punch above his weight, punch above his position in line, both to work with his father and to work with the late King Abdullah to, if you will, ingratiate himself, to make himself useful to, most Saudis, when he became deputy crown prince, really didn't know anything about him and were shocked at his being in that position. I've met him now half a dozen times, and he's definitely a smart man. And I think he's calculating. He's also willing to be cruel, but that's the history of the Saudi Al Saud, if you will. The leader does what's necessary to retain leadership. It's a tribal country, and when it was a bunch of tribes fighting each other, if you're the tribal leader and you can't deliver for your tribe, someone kills you and takes your place. So it's necessary to be tough and to be on top of your game. And I think what distinguishes him is that he isn't so much trying to play royal family politics and balance this uncle against that cousin. He is going for the youth, as I already said. He is trying to, and it seems to be working pretty well. Most young Saudis are very happy. It's easier to get a job now, not a government job, but private sector job. They can dance in the streets. Women can go to soccer matches, which used to be forbidden. Women can do anything now, and everything used to be forbidden except producing children, because that was a woman's job, to produce babies. So I think he does know his society, and Saudis say that he never went to university abroad like some of his brothers or many other Saudis. He was educated entirely in Saudi Arabia, spent a lot of time with his father on tribal issues, that he is a product of his society. And even though he's very aware, I think, of the wider world, he doesn't try to be a sophisticate to impress you with where he vacationed last time. He vacations in Saudi Arabia now to try to set an example for how Saudis should spend their money at home and not be going to Dubai and Europe and Los Angeles. So I think he is a part of the society, and like his grandfather who created the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia, he is determined to sustain control of it and drive it forward, or, as we say in Texas, die trying. He's very committed. He's not a playboy. He works incredible hours and makes everyone else work incredible hours. He now says he's taking off more time than he did for many, many years. I'm not there to see whether that's true or not, but he's not a dilettante.
I want to circle back just briefly before we go. In both the Trump years and now during the Biden presidency, it's been remarkable to watch country after country look for ways to do something new with Israel without even breathing the word Palestinian or Palestine. For people who remember Arab League meetings in the 70s and 80s when Yasser Arafat, with a pistol on his hip, was hailed as a resistance hero, Israel was pilloried, and today's state of play seemed impossible. It's been remarkable to see the fate of the Palestinians recede as an issue. And I wonder if you think that's part of what Hamas has just done, and whether other countries are going to be forced to respond to that.
Yeah, I think Hamas's attention is much more than just disrupting Saudi-Israeli dialogue about diplomatic relations. It is about trying to put the Palestinians back on the front burner and in the headlines, and make it impossible for people to not talk about their lives and the pain that they suffer. And because it's become as you say, nobody talks about it anymore. And I think they are trying very much to put it front and center. And I'm sure they're happy to see campuses in the U.S. like Harvard, and I think Columbia also, but I'm sure others protesting Israel and the squad ladies making comments about Israel has done terrible things to the Palestinians. Why are we focusing only on what Hamas is doing to Israel, et cetera? And I think they will succeed to reintroducing it, at least for a time. The question is, how will it be sustained? I mean, if Hamas is destroyed by Israel, as a lot of people are advising it to do, to end its policy of mow the grass, just keep Hamas down and not dangerous, because obviously the grass suddenly grew and bit them. So they are being urged to take out Hamas, but nobody knows what would come next. So that's a problem. But if there is some Palestinian leadership that tries to find a way to keep the Palestinians front and center, then maybe it will last. But I think Israel has been successful. Israel has gotten the other Arab countries largely to work with it. And if Saudi Arabia recognizes it, you will get other Muslim countries being willing to work with Israel. So I think the balance right now is, can Israel retain the smothering of the Palestinian issue that it has succeeded at for the last longer than the Abraham Accords, the last 10, 15 years since the Oslo Accords.
Karen Elliott House is the author of On Saudi Arabia, Its People, Past, Religion, Fault Lines, and Future. She's also chair of the board of the RAND Corporation. Karen Elliott House, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Adam Ailey and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Young is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.